Defining America's red lines, a century of global intervention. The concept of a red line in U.S. foreign policy is both fluid and fraught. It represents the point at which the United States deems a situation to be so critical to its national interests that it is prepared to use military force. Historically, these red lines have shifted with changing administrations and global power dynamics. From the Monroe Doctrine to the Truman Doctrine, the U.S. has long asserted its role as a guarantor of global security, often drawing lines in the sand that have shaped the geopolitical landscape. The 20th century saw the U.S. engage in major conflicts, from world wars to the Cold War, in defense of its perceived red lines. These lines were often drawn against the backdrop of ideological battles, economic interests, and strategic alliances. The post-Cold War era presented new challenges, with the U.S. grappling with rogue states, terrorism, and the rise of new global powers. The red lines in this era became more nuanced, often focusing on issues like nuclear proliferation, human rights violations, and threats to international stability. The U.S.'s willingness to enforce these red lines, however, has always been a subject of debate. Critics argue that the U.S. has often been too quick to use military force, leading to costly and protracted conflicts. They point to instances where the U.S. has failed to act decisively, allowing humanitarian crises to unfold. This debate underscores the complex calculations that go into defining and enforcing America's red lines on the global stage. The recent conflict in Gaza has once again brought the concept of U.S. red lines into sharp focus. As a staunch ally of Israel, the U.S. has long provided military and diplomatic support to the Jewish state. However, the escalating violence in Gaza, the scale of civilian casualties, and the potential for a wider regional conflict have tested the limits of U.S. tolerance and raised questions about where exactly America's red lines lie in this volatile region. Gaza Flashpoint: Testing the limits of U.S. tolerance. The recent conflict between Israel and Hamas, the militant group that controls Gaza, has presented a significant foreign policy challenge for the Biden administration. The conflict, triggered by rocket attacks from Gaza and Israeli airstrikes in response, quickly escalated into a full-blown war, resulting in a humanitarian crisis in the densely populated Gaza Strip. The U.S., while firmly supporting Israel's right to defend itself, has also expressed concern over the mounting civilian casualties and called for a ceasefire. President Biden, walking a diplomatic tightrope, has sought to balance support for Israel with the need to de-escalate the conflict and address the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. In public statements, Biden has reiterated the U.S.'s ironclad commitment to Israel's security while also urging restraint and emphasizing the need for a negotiated two-state solution. However, the administration has faced criticism from both sides of the aisle, with some accusing Biden of not doing enough to support Israel, and others calling for a more forceful intervention to end the violence. The U.S. has also found itself at odds with some of its international partners, particularly at the United Nations, where calls for a ceasefire have been met with resistance from the U.S. The Biden administration has so far blocked several attempts at the UN Security Council to issue a joint statement condemning the violence, arguing that such a move would be counterproductive and undermine efforts to de-escalate the situation. This stance has further fueled accusations of a double standard and highlighted the challenges the U.S. faces in navigating the complex geopolitical dynamics of the Middle East. The situation in Gaza presents a critical test for the Biden administration's foreign policy, particularly its approach to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The U.S. finds itself caught between its long-standing commitment to Israel's security and its stated goal of promoting human rights and a peaceful resolution to the conflict. How the Biden administration navigates this delicate balance will have significant implications not only for the immediate situation in Gaza, but also for the long-term stability of the region and the credibility of U.S. leadership on the global stage. Biden's balancing act: navigating diplomacy and alliances. The Biden administration's response to the Gaza conflict has been characterized by a delicate balancing act, seeking to maintain its unwavering support for Israel, while also urging restraint and calling for a peaceful resolution. This approach reflects the complex realities of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, where the U.S. must navigate a web of alliances, historical grievances, and competing interests. On the one hand, the U.S. has a deep and enduring relationship with Israel, based on shared values, strategic interests, and strong domestic political support. The U.S. has long provided Israel with military aid, diplomatic backing, and a protective shield at international forums like the United Nations. This unwavering support has been a cornerstone of U.S. policy in the region for decades, and the Biden administration has shown no indication of deviating from this course. On the other hand, the U.S. also recognizes the plight of the Palestinians and the need for a just and lasting solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The Biden administration has revived diplomatic channels with the Palestinian Authority, restored humanitarian aid, and expressed support for a two-state solution. However, these efforts have been overshadowed by the escalating violence in Gaza and the perception that the U.S. is biased towards Israel. This balancing act has placed the Biden administration in a difficult position, facing criticism both domestically and internationally for its handling of the crisis. Some accuse the U.S. of being too lenient on Israel, failing to hold it accountable for civilian casualties and the disproportionate use of force. Others criticize the U.S. for not doing enough to pressure Hamas to cease its rocket attacks and for blocking international efforts to condemn the violence. The Biden administration's response to the Gaza conflict highlights the inherent challenges of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. Balancing its commitment to Israel with its broader regional interests and its stated values will require careful diplomacy, a nuanced understanding of the historical context, and a willingness to engage with all parties to the conflict. Section 4. International Backlash: A World Divided on Gaza. The recent conflict in Gaza has ignited a firestorm of international condemnation and sparked protests across the globe, exposing deep divisions within the international community over the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the role of the United States in the region. The escalating violence and the mounting civilian casualties in Gaza have drawn widespread criticism, particularly from human rights groups and many countries in the Middle East and beyond. These critics accuse Israel of using disproportionate force, targeting civilian infrastructure, and exacerbating the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. They have also condemned the U.S. for its perceived complicity in Israel's actions, citing its unwavering support for Israel at the United Nations and its reluctance to hold Israel accountable for its actions. The conflict has also exposed the limitations of international institutions like the United Nations in addressing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Despite numerous calls for a ceasefire and a negotiated solution, the UN Security Council has been unable to agree on a unified response, largely due to the United States' veto power and its reluctance to support any resolution that it deems critical of Israel. This impasse has further fueled accusations of a double standard and undermined the credibility of the UN in addressing the crisis. The international backlash to the Gaza conflict underscores the deep-seated emotions and the complex geopolitical dynamics surrounding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It has also highlighted the growing frustration with the U.S.'s perceived bias towards Israel and its reluctance to use its leverage to pressure Israel to end the occupation and negotiate a just and lasting peace with the Palestinians. The international community's response to the conflict in Gaza is a stark reminder of the challenges the Biden administration faces in navigating the complex realities of the Middle East. It also underscores the need for a more balanced and even-handed approach to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, one that prioritizes human rights, diplomacy, and a just and lasting peace for both Israelis and Palestinians. Section 5. The Long Road Ahead: Peace, Diplomacy, and the Future of U.S.-Israeli Relations. The recent conflict in Gaza has cast a long shadow over the future of U.S.-Israeli relations and the prospects for peace in the Middle East. While the Biden administration has reaffirmed its unwavering commitment to Israel's security, the conflict has exposed underlying tensions and the need for a more nuanced and balanced approach to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The Biden administration faces the daunting task of rebuilding trust with the Palestinians and the Arab world, which has been eroded by years of perceived U.S. bias towards Israel. The administration's efforts to revive diplomatic channels with the Palestinian Authority and restore humanitarian aid are a step in the right direction, but more needs to be done to address the root causes of the conflict, including the occupation, the expansion of settlements, and the lack of a political horizon for the Palestinians. The U.S. also needs to engage more actively with its international partners, particularly in Europe and the Middle East, to find a sustainable solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This includes working through multilateral forums like the United Nations to revive the peace process and create the conditions for a negotiated two-state solution. A united international front is essential to pressure both sides to make the necessary concessions for peace. The U.S.-Israeli relationship, while strong and enduring, will need to evolve to reflect the changing realities of the Middle East. Blind support for Israel's actions without regard for Palestinian rights or international law is unsustainable and counterproductive. The U.S. must be willing to use its leverage to hold Israel accountable for its actions and to push for a just and lasting solution to the conflict. The road to peace in the Middle East is long and arduous, but the U.S. has a critical role to play in facilitating a just and lasting solution. By pursuing a more balanced and even-handed approach, prioritizing diplomacy and dialogue, and working in concert with international partners, the Biden administration can help to break the cycle of violence and create a more hopeful future for both Israelis and Palestinians.